She only wanted one thing: to get out alive. One desperate text message, one wrong number. And the man who received it wasn't a friend, wasn't a hero, wasn't anyone she should have ever trusted. He was the most dangerous man in the city. And he came anyway. What happens when the person who saves you is the one everyone warned you to run from? When danger wears the face of protection? When one wrong number changes every single thing? Stay until the very end. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since early afternoon, the kind that didn't come down clean but arrived in cold, dirty sheets that smelled of exhaust and wet concrete, the kind of rain that made the city feel smaller and meaner than it actually was. By 7 o'clock, it was dark enough that the neon signs along the lower streets bled color into the puddles on the sidewalk: crimson, gold, electric blue, and the whole neighborhood looked like something printed on the inside of a fever dream. Alara Quinn stood in front of the mirror in her apartment bathroom and told herself she was fine. She said it out loud, which she knew was a bad sign. "You're fine." The mirror didn't agree. The woman looking back at her had shadows under her eyes she'd tried to conceal with 2 layers of coverage and the kind of careful, effortful smile that took actual muscle memory to maintain. 26 years old, and she'd gotten very good at maintaining it. She'd grown up in a house where you maintain things. Expressions, silences, appearances, and old training died hard. She smoothed the front of her dress. Black, fitted, understated. She'd bought it 8 months ago for a gallery opening she'd attended alone and ended up leaving early. It had hung in her closet since then like a small accusation. Tonight she was finally wearing it again, and she was going to stop overthinking, and she was going to have a good time, because Dante Moretti was exactly the kind of man a woman was supposed to be grateful for. That was what her coworker Priya had said, anyway. "Alara, he's gorgeous, and he's got money, and he actually texts back, 'What is your problem?'" She didn't have a problem. She told herself that after the first date, when Dante had ordered a bottle of wine without consulting her, and she'd felt a flicker of something uncomfortable she immediately dismissed as her own neurosis. She'd told herself that after the second date, when he'd made a comment about her phone case, some cheap plastic thing she'd bought from a street vendor, and laughed in a way that wasn't quite warm enough to be a joke. She was too sensitive. She was reading into things. She had a history of reading into things. She turned off the bathroom light and went to get her coat. Velvet Meridian sat on the 41st floor of a glass tower downtown, and on a clear night you could see 3 bridges from its east-facing windows. Tonight, there were no bridges visible through the rain, only the smeared glow of 1,000,000 lit windows and the occasional sweep of headlights far below. The elevator opened directly into the restaurant, and the hostess recognized Dante immediately, not by name, Alara noticed, but by the specific category of man he represented, the kind with reservations that were confirmed twice, the kind for whom tables appeared at the front rather than near the kitchen. Dante was already seated when she arrived, standing the moment he saw her, moving around the table with the particular grace of a man who had practiced being watched. "You look incredible," he said, and kissed her cheek, and his hand rested briefly at the small of her back in a way that was simultaneously intimate and proprietary, and Alara smiled and said thank you, and they sat down, and everything was fine. It was fine for approximately 22 minutes. She tracked it later, after everything, and it was 22 minutes before the first thing happened that she should have treated as a door swinging shut instead of a window briefly darkening. 22 minutes of competent, rehearsed conversation, his recent trip to Milan, a gallery in the meatpacking district he'd apparently been to, something about a renovation on his place in the Hamptons. He asked her questions too, but they had a quality to them she couldn't quite name at the time, like questions asked not because you wanted the answers, but because you understood that asking them was part of the performance. She'd been talking about her work, a brand identity project she was genuinely excited about, a small sustainable clothing company run by 2 sisters out of Brooklyn, when the server appeared to take their orders. Dante spoke first. He ordered for both of them. Not in a consultative way, not with a sideways glance at her to confirm, but with the flat, easy authority of a man who did not consider that there was any other way to do this. He ordered her the salmon. He chose a wine she hadn't touched. He handed both menus to the server without looking at Alara at all. The server left. Alara said, "I was actually thinking about the risotto." Dante smiled. It was a practice smile, the one she'd seen in photos of him online, slightly asymmetrical, confident without being aggressive, designed to read as warmth from a distance. Up close, it had a different quality. "The salmon here is exceptional," he said. "You'll thank me." She didn't say anything else about the risotto. She picked up her water glass and took a sip and watched him over the rim and felt the flicker again. The same one from the first date, a little stronger this time, less easy to dismiss. And she set the glass down and returned to the conversation and told herself she was being ridiculous. This was the thing about Alara Quinn that she understood about herself and couldn't seem to correct. She was very good at identifying the moment when something was wrong and then immediately, reflexively talking herself out of it. It was a skill she'd developed young. Her father had been a man who required management, who required the careful navigation of moods and temperatures, and her mother had taught her, not in words, never in words, but in the precise choreography of how you moved through a house, how you read a room, how you absorbed conflict before it could become collision, that the safest thing was to be agreeable, to be smooth, to find the reasonable explanation for the unreasonable thing rather than acknowledge the unreasonable thing directly. Dante refilled her wine glass without asking. She watched his hands. They were large hands, well-maintained, a signet ring on the right index finger. The ring bothered her in a way she couldn't articulate. Not the ring itself. It was probably just a family thing, an inheritance. Plenty of men wore rings like that. But something about the way his hand moved when he set the bottle back down, with the absolute certainty of ownership. "You're quiet," Dante observed. "I'm listening," she said. He studied her for a moment. Then he smiled again, and this time the asymmetry was more pronounced. And he said, "Good," and turned back to his food. Good. Like it was the correct answer she'd given. Like she'd passed a small test she hadn't known she was taking. The salmon arrived, and it was, objectively, excellent, perfectly cooked, beautifully plated, the kind of dish that cost $40 and was worth every cent on a purely technical level. She ate it and hated herself a little for how good it was. She thought about the risotto. She thought about the way he'd said good with that small, satisfied downward inflection. And she thought about her mother moving quietly through their kitchen at 6 a.m, trying not to wake her father. And she pushed the thought down because she was not doing that tonight. She was not comparing Dante Moretti to her father. That was catastrophizing. That was exactly the kind of disproportionate reaction Priya would roll her eyes at. They were on the second bottle of wine. Dante was on his third glass. Alara had barely touched her second when the conversation shifted. It happened gradually, the way water temperature changes when you're already in it. He'd been talking about a business associate, some deal that had gone wrong because of what Dante described as fundamental untrustworthiness, people who smiled at you and meant nothing by it, people who didn't understand that loyalty was the only real currency. It was the kind of speech that probably sounded compelling if you were listening with your guard down. It had an internal logic. But Alara was listening carefully now, had been listening carefully for the last 40 minutes with the quiet, trained attention she'd learned in childhood, and what she was hearing underneath the words was something else. Relationships require structure, Dante said. He was leaning back slightly, one arm draped over the chair beside him, occupying space with the unthinking ease of a man who had never been required to make himself smaller. People want to pretend they don't, but they do. Someone leads, someone follows. That's not a power thing. That's just how things function. That's one framework, Alara said carefully. It's the honest one. He looked at her directly. Most women say they want a partner, equal terms, all that. But what they actually respond to is someone who knows what he wants and takes it. They find it attractive even when they tell themselves they don't. Alara set her fork down. The motion was small and controlled, and she made sure her face gave nothing. That's a pretty broad generalization, she said. It's an observation. His voice was unchanged, pleasant, conversational, like they were discussing weather patterns. I've had enough relationships to know what works. The women who were happiest with me were the ones who stopped fighting the structure and let me handle things. And the women who weren't happy? Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite anger, something adjacent to it, something that had been in the same neighborhood as anger long enough that it had started to resemble it. They had their own issues, he said. That's the honest answer. You can't help someone who doesn't know what they need. Alara picked her fork back up. She ate a small piece of salmon. She kept her breathing steady and even because her chest had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude and everything to do with the very specific sensation of understanding that you were in a closed space with someone who was not what they had presented themselves to be. And the closed space was 41 floors above the ground, and the only exit was the elevator, and he was sitting between her and the elevator. She told herself she was overreacting. She had her phone in her lap. She'd checked it twice during dinner already. Once legitimately, a work notification she'd dismissed. And Dante had commented on it both times, not harshly, but with that same light, even quality, a gentle correction that wasn't quite a correction, a small reminder that her attention was supposed to be here, on him, undivided. The phone felt like a lifeline she wasn't sure she was allowed to reach for. She excused herself to use the restroom. In the marble and mirror quiet of the women's room, Alara stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists and stared at her own reflection and had a very honest conversation with herself that she was already regretting before it was finished. The conversation went like this. Something is wrong. You know something is wrong. You have known something was wrong for at least an hour. And the fact that you cannot point to a single unambiguous action does not mean you are inventing it. She pulled out her phone. She opened her messages. She meant to text Priya. She had Priya's name almost memorized in her contact list, fourth down, right below her mother and her dentist. And her fingers were cold from the water, and her hands were not entirely steady. And she typed the message fast, the way you do when you're saying something you need to say before you can stop yourself. I'm scared. I need help. I can't get away from him. She hit send, and then she looked at the name at the top of the conversation thread. It wasn't Priya. The contact read, Unknown, 347-809-2241. She had no idea whose number that was. She'd never texted it before. It wasn't saved in her phone. Somehow, in the cold and the shaking and the unfamiliar restroom light, her fingers had opened a blank thread instead of Priya's name, and she had sent her fear to a stranger. Her stomach dropped. She stood there for 3 full seconds doing nothing, which felt like a long time. Then the reply came. Where are you? She stared at it, 2 words. No punctuation after the question mark. Typed fast or typed by someone who was very calm, she couldn't tell which. There was no tone to extract from 2 words. There was no way to know if this was a confused stranger about to ask her to clarify the wrong number or something else. There was no way to know anything. She typed back, wrong number, sorry, ignore. The reply was immediate. Tell me where you are. Her heart was going very fast. She pressed her back against the cold marble wall and looked at the door and thought about Dante on the other side of it, at that table, in that chair, and the way he'd said good like she was a dog that had learned a command, and the ring on his hand, and the specific quality of the look he'd given her when she'd asked about the women who hadn't been happy with him. She typed the name of the restaurant. She stood in the restroom for another 90 seconds. She reapplied her lipstick because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. She read the reply that came through. Stay where people can see you. Do not leave with him. When she walked back to the table, Dante was looking at his phone. He set it face down when he saw her, but not before she caught the angle of his expression. Not curiosity, not the ordinary preoccupation of someone checking messages, but something more concentrated, more directed. He looked up and smiled. Everything okay? Fine, she said, and sat down. The word tasted like copper. They were 15 minutes from the end of dinner, or what should have been the end of dinner. Dessert menus arrived, and Alara was preparing to say she was tired, to manufacture the graceful exit, to get out of this elevated glass box and into a cab heading anywhere else, when Dante's phone buzzed on the table. He flipped it over. He read the screen. The change was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change you'd catch on a security camera or describe to someone afterward in a way that would sound like anything. His expression didn't collapse or distort, but something left it. Some architectural element that had been holding the whole thing up quietly departed, and what remained looked older and harder and very much less interested in performing charm. He set the phone down. He looked at her. Who did you call? He asked. His voice was the same, exactly the same. That was somehow worse than if it had changed. I didn't call anyone, she said. Your phone. In the bathroom. I texted a friend to let her know I was still here. I always do that. She kept her voice level. She had spent years keeping her voice level in conversations that frightened her, and the muscle memory was still there, intact, available. It's just a safety thing. A safety thing. He repeated it like he was examining the phrase for structural weaknesses. You felt like you needed a safety thing. It's just a habit. He looked at her for a long moment. The restaurant around them continued its ambient performance. Silverware on china, murmured conversation, the soft architecture of expensive sound. And Alara was acutely aware of all of it, the way you become aware of the room when the room is the only thing standing between you and the thing that frightens you. You've been distracted all night, Dante said. I've been patient about it. I'm not distracted. You are. Not an argument. A correction. The kind you deliver to someone who doesn't yet know they're wrong but will. I don't know what you were expecting from tonight, but I've put real time into this, into you, and I think you owe me a real conversation about where your head is. I'm right here, she said. We're having a conversation. No. He leaned forward, and his hand moved under the table, and then his fingers were around her wrist, not crushing it, not violent, just present, just there, just enough pressure to be absolutely clear about what the pressure meant. We're having the conversation I want to have. Tell me who you texted. Her phone buzzed. She couldn't look at it. He was watching her face, and she couldn't look at her phone without him seeing her look at it, and the grip on her wrist wasn't loosening, and her pulse was very loud in her own ears, and the nearest occupied table was 11 feet away, and everyone at it was talking to each other and looking at each other, and no one was looking at her. Dante. She kept her voice quiet, controlled. Let go of my wrist. I'll let go when we're done talking. We're done talking, she said. Let go. Something crossed his face, fast, almost imperceptible. She'd seen something like it before, in a different context, a different face, and the recognition of it landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. He released her wrist. He sat back. He picked up his wine glass. You're making a scene, he said pleasantly. I haven't said a word above a normal conversation level, she said. In your head, you're making a scene. He swirled the wine. It's written all over you. You're dramatic. That's fine. I knew that going in. But there are limits to what I'll tolerate in public. She reached under the table and picked up her phone. The message on the screen read, Help is already on the way. She read it twice. Her hand was not steady. She set the phone face down on the tablecloth because Dante was watching her and she didn't want him to see the screen, and she looked up at him and said, I'd like the check, please. And his expression went very still in a way that reminded her of the surface of water before weather. We haven't had dessert, he said. I'm not hungry. Alara. I'm not hungry, Dante. I'd like the check. He studied her for what felt like a very long time. Then he signaled the server with the particular small gesture of a man accustomed to being seen immediately. And the server came, and the check materialized, and Dante paid it without looking at the amount. And all of it was performed with such smooth, controlled efficiency that someone watching from across the room would have seen a successful man ending a pleasant dinner. He stood up. He held out her coat. She stood up and took the coat from his hands and pulled it on herself, without letting him help her into it, which was a small thing and probably invisible to anyone else, but which she needed to do. We should talk about this, Dante said, low and even, as they moved toward the elevator bank. Not here. Somewhere private. I don't think so, she said. I think you owe me... The elevator lobby doors opened. Not the elevator itself. The glass doors leading from the main restaurant floor into the lobby. The ones that guests used when they arrived. The ones that had admitted Alara 45 minutes ago when she'd stepped off the elevator in her black dress, thinking she was about to have an evening that proved she was capable of normal things. The man who came through those doors was tall, dressed in a black coat that fit him with a precision that wasn't accidental, and he was alone. He moved without hurry, which was the first thing you noticed, because the way he moved was not the way someone moves when they're rushing somewhere. It was the way someone moves when everywhere they go is, by definition, exactly where they're supposed to be. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired. His face was the kind of face that had been arranged by inheritance into something striking, but that wore its striking quality the way old buildings wear it. Not decoratively, not performatively, but as a structural fact. His eyes moved across the room with a speed and specificity that didn't look like casual observation. They found her immediately. and then they moved to Dante. The manager materialized beside the man in the black coat as if produced from the air itself, murmuring something, nodding with the particular curvature of a spine that understood hierarchy. A server who had been walking with a full tray paused at the edge of the room, recalibrated, took a wider path. Two men near the bar, men who had been standing in the easy posture of people waiting for friends, shifted their weight subtly toward attention. Elara watched all of it happen in the space of 4 seconds. Dante saw the man. The color in his face changed. It was not subtle. It was not the kind of thing you could mistake for anything else. The blood left his face the way water leaves a glass that has been tilted, and what remained was something gray and exposed and very much smaller than the man who had spent the last hour performing control at a dinner table. The tall man in the black coat crossed the room toward them. He stopped 3 feet from Dante. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to raise his voice. He said 4 words. Elara couldn't hear them. She was 2 steps behind Dante, and the ambient sound of the restaurant was between her and the exchange, and whatever those 4 words were, they were spoken very quietly, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of volume, but presence of something else entirely. Dante said something back, 1 syllable, maybe 2. The man in the black coat looked at him for a moment longer, not with anger, not with anything she could name that simply... And then Dante picked up his jacket from the coat check stand he hadn't reached yet, and he walked to the elevator, and he pressed the button, and he stood with his back to the room and did not turn around. And when the elevator arrived, he stepped inside it, and the doors closed, and he was gone. The entire thing had taken less than 90 seconds. The restaurant resumed around her, conversations restarted. The server with the tray continued on his original path. The manager drifted back toward the host stand with the smooth, practiced ease of someone whose job required pretending that certain things did not happen. The man in the black coat turned to face her. He had eyes that were dark. Not dramatically dark. Not the kind you'd describe in a story, just dark and very steady. The kind of eyes that had learned not to communicate surprise, because surprise was a resource that cost something. "Elara Quinn," he said. It was not a question. She said yes. He said, "You sent the message." "I sent it to the wrong number," she said. "I didn't mean to send it to you. I don't even know who you are." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the restaurant glittered and hummed. 41 floors below, the city moved through its reign. "My name is Lucien Devereaux," he said. "Sit down. I'll explain what I can." She didn't sit down. Not immediately. She stood there looking at him with her coat half on and her pulse still elevated and the memory of Dante's hand on her wrist still sitting in her nervous system like an echo. And she said, "Why did he leave?" Lucien looked at her. "Because I asked him to," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the complete one," he said. "Sit down, Ms. Quinn. You're safe. He won't come back tonight." She looked at the table he was gesturing toward. Not her table, a different one, near the windows, away from the center of the room. She looked at the door to the elevator. She looked at the man named Lucien Devereaux, who had arrived without warning and dismantled a situation in 90 seconds, using only words spoken quietly enough that she couldn't hear them. Every rational signal in her body said, "You do not know this man, you know nothing about him. The fact that he removed one threat does not make him safe. Get in the elevator, get in a cab, go home." She sat down across from him. She didn't know why. She would think about it later, try to isolate the variable. Was it exhaustion or fear or the specific quality of his stillness, which was so different from Dante's controlled performance that it read, against all logic, as trustworthy? She would not arrive at a satisfying answer. She sat down, and he sat across from her, and outside the windows the city burned and rained in equal measure, and whatever ordinary Tuesday night she had been living before she walked into this restaurant was already gone. She just didn't know it yet. The server appeared at the table's edge, tentative, reading the room. Lucien looked up. "2 coffees," he said. "That's all." The server left. Elara unwound her coat from her shoulders and set it over the back of the chair and looked at the man across from her and said, "How did you know my name?" "The reservation," he said. Moretti's reservation was under both names. The manager confirmed when I arrived. "And you just asked the manager?" "Yes." "And he just told you?" Lucien didn't respond to that directly. He looked at her with the same steady quality he'd had since he walked in, and after a moment he said, "Do you want to talk about what happened tonight, or do you want to go home? Both are fine. I'll have someone drive you if you want to leave." "I want to understand what just happened," she said. "All right? Starting with who you are." He was quiet for a moment. The coffees arrived. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at it, and then looked back at her. And something in his expression shifted. A very small shift, almost architectural, like the adjustment of a single load-bearing element. And he said, "I'll tell you enough to answer your question. Whether you want to hear more after that is your decision." "Okay," she said. "Your message reached a number I use for a very small number of people. Not a public number. Not something that should have been reachable the way you reached it. I don't know how you got there. Probably a misdial, wrong digit, something like that." He paused. Most people who'd received that message from a stranger would have ignored it. "Why didn't you?" He looked at the window, at the rain and the city beneath it. 5 years ago, he said, someone I cared about sent a message like yours. Same kind. Wrong place, bad situation, needed help. He stopped, started again. "I didn't get there in time." The sentence was very simple. It carried weight out of proportion to its syllable count. Elara said, "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." He said it like a man who knew that a long time ago was not the same thing as not anymore. "When your message came through, I was 20 minutes from here. It wasn't difficult. It also wasn't your responsibility." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She looked at him. At the ring he didn't wear, she'd noticed the absence of it. The absence of anything decorative. Actually, nothing on his hands, no watch, nothing on the coat lapels, none of the signaling that men like Dante used to announce their category. His signals, if he had them, were of a different order. "The manager," she said. "The way the room moved when you walked in. The way Dante—" She stopped. "What exactly is it that you do, Mr. Devereaux?" He met her eyes, and he didn't look away, and he said, "I think you already have a reasonable idea." She did. She'd been constructing the idea since the moment the server with the tray had altered his path, since the moment the men at the bar had shifted their weight, since the moment Dante Moretti, who had spent an entire dinner performing the theater of a man who feared nothing, had stood in an elevator lobby watching another man cross a room toward him and had gone the color of old chalk. "How much trouble am I in," she said, "for knowing your name?" Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. The potential of one. "Right now?" he said. "None." "And not right now?" He lifted his coffee cup. "You're not in my world, Miss Quinn. Tonight was a coincidence. You can walk out of here and never think about it again." "Can I?" she said. It came out flatter than she intended, drier, and he looked at her with a sharpening of attention, like someone adjusting focus. "You could," he said. "Whether you will or not depends on Dante Moretti." "What does that mean?" Lucian set his cup down. He looked at her with the kind of directness that wasn't aggression, but was its own species of uncomfortable. The directness of someone who had stopped bothering to soften information because they'd learned that softening it didn't change what it was. "Men like Moretti," he said, "don't absorb humiliation cleanly. He left tonight because I asked him to, and he understood what asking meant. But he's going to spend the next 48 hours deciding how he feels about that. And when he decides, he's going to feel humiliated. And when he feels humiliated, he'll come back," she said. "He'll do something," Lucian said. "Whether it's directed at you specifically depends on how much he decides tonight was your fault." The city glittered in the rain below them. 41 floors of glass and distance between them and the street. "What are you offering?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Information," he said. "Tonight. If you want more after that, we can discuss it." "No conditions?" "No conditions." She studied his face. She was good at reading faces, had been, since childhood, necessity making her fluent in a language she'd never asked to learn. His face was harder to read than most, not because it was deceptive, but because it was controlled in a different way than Dante's controlled. Not performance, but discipline. The kind of control that comes from deciding very carefully what you show the world and then holding to that decision. She could not tell, looking at him, whether he was someone she should trust. She could tell that he was someone who meant exactly what he said. She picked up her coffee. Tell me about Dante Moretti, she said. And outside the windows, the rain kept coming down, and the city went about its ordinary violent business, and somewhere 41 floors below, a man in an elevator was deciding how he felt about tonight, and the woman at the window table was already too far across the line to find her way back to the side where none of this had happened yet. Lucienne began to talk. Lucienne talked for 11 minutes. Alara knew because she was watching the small clock on her phone screen, face up on the table between them, and she watched the minutes change the way you watch things when you need something concrete to hold on to while someone is rearranging everything you thought you understood about the last 3 weeks of your life. He didn't editorialize. That was the first thing she noticed. He laid information down the way a man lays tools on a workbench, each piece in its place. No excess motion, no rhetorical flourish designed to make her feel a particular way about what she was hearing. He told her that Dante Moretti had a history. That history involved 3 women in the last 4 years. That 2 of them had filed reports and then quietly withdrawn them. That the third had moved to another city and declined to discuss it with anyone. He told her that Dante had business associations that wouldn't survive scrutiny. That several of those associations connected through 2 or 3 degrees of separation to enterprises Lucian had reason to be aware of. He told her that Dante had, in all likelihood, run a basic background check on her before their first date. That the kind of man Dante was tended to select for specific qualities, women who were self-sufficient enough to seem desirable but isolated enough to seem manageable. He stopped talking. Alara looked at her coffee cup. It was half empty. She didn't remember drinking it. The 2 women who filed reports, she said. What happened to them? They're fine, Lucian said. As far as I know. As far as you know. I don't track them. I'm telling you what I was able to find in the time between your message and arriving here. She looked up. You ran a background check on Dante in 20 minutes. In 15, he said. Not boasting, just accurate. She sat with that for a moment, with the specific texture of what it meant, that this man had access to information that should have taken weeks to compile, that he'd assembled it in the time it took her to eat an unwanted piece of salmon, that the infrastructure required to do that was not something that existed in the ordinary world she inhabited. You said you'd tell me enough to answer my question, she said. About who you are. I did. You didn't actually tell me anything. I told you my name, he said, and I think you filled in the rest. She had. She'd been filling it in piece by piece since he walked through those doors, and the picture it was forming was clear enough that she didn't need him to narrate it. You didn't need a man to describe the ocean to know you were standing in front of it. Why are you being careful about it? She asked. Not saying it directly. Because you're a stranger, he said. And because what you know and what you can prove are 2 different categories, and right now you're better off with a wide gap between them. For my sake or yours? He looked at her. Both. She pushed her coffee cup an inch to the left, then an inch back. She was thinking about the way Priya had described Dante 3 weeks ago. Gorgeous, money, texts back. And thinking about how efficient that description was. How it reduced a person to 3 data points that were all surface, and none of them told you anything about what happened in closed spaces when the performance was no longer required. I need to ask you something, she said. All right. Tonight, what you did. Do I owe you something for that? He didn't answer immediately, which she was beginning to understand was his version of taking the question seriously. No, he said. That's a very clean answer for a complicated situation. You didn't ask for my help. You sent a message to the wrong number. I made a choice to respond. The consequences of my choices are mine. She studied him. People don't operate like that. Some people do. Not in my experience. Your experience, he said, based on tonight, includes Dante Moretti. I'd suggest it's a limited sample. Something moved in her chest. Not warmth. She wasn't there yet, wasn't anywhere near there, but something grudging and reluctant. The specific sensation of recognizing that someone has said something accurate. So what happens now? She said. Now you go home. Tonight you're fine. He won't move that fast. He's not impulsive, he calculates. You have a day, maybe 2, before he decides on a response. And then? Then it depends on what his response is. He reached into his coat and produced a card. Not a business card, just a card, plain white, with a number on it, different from the one she'd texted. If something happens, if he contacts you or you feel like something is wrong, use that. She looked at the card, small rectangle of white in the ambient light of the restaurant. You're giving me a way to reach you, she said. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a beat. Because I was late once, he said. I don't intend to be late again. She picked up the card. She put it in the pocket of her coat without looking at it again, because looking at it again would have meant something she wasn't ready for it to mean. I'll get someone to drive you, he said, and stood. And that was how the evening ended. Not with drama, not with anything that would have looked like anything from the outside. Just a woman in a black dress putting on her coat in an expensive restaurant, while a man in a black coat said something brief to the manager, and a car materialized at the curb downstairs within 4 minutes, like it had been waiting. It probably had been waiting. She got in the car. The driver didn't speak. The city moved past the windows in wet streaks of light. She sat in the back with her hands folded in her lap and her pulse finally coming down from wherever it had been for the last 2 hours. And she thought about the card in her coat pocket. And she thought about Lucien Devereaux's voice saying I was late once. And she thought about the way Dante's hand had felt around her wrist. She didn't sleep well. She didn't expect to. The next 2 days were quiet in the way that pressure systems are quiet. Not absence of something, but presence of potential. She went to work. She sat at her desk in the open-plan studio on the 6th floor of a building in Midtown and looked at brand guidelines and color palettes and tried to think about the two sisters in Brooklyn and their sustainable clothing company and the identity project she'd been genuinely excited about 3 days ago, before the world rearranged itself. She didn't tell Priya. She didn't know how to begin, and Priya would ask questions, and the questions would require answers that would sound insane, and she wasn't ready to have the conversation that ended with Priya looking at her the way people look at someone who's made a series of decisions that don't quite add up. On the second day, Dante texted her. The message was courteous. Carefully courteous, the deliberate courtesy of someone who understood that the written record of a text message had a different weight than spoken words. He said he hoped she'd gotten home safely. He said he felt bad about how the evening ended. He said he'd been dealing with a difficult situation at work that had affected his mood, and he thought they deserved a chance to start over. She read it 3 times. She did not respond. An hour later, another message arrived, slightly less courteous. He'd been thinking about her behavior at dinner, actually, and he wanted to be honest with her. He'd found her distant and unengaged, and he didn't think that was fair to him, given the effort he'd made. She put her phone face down on her desk. Her project manager, a thin, efficient man named Garrett, stopped at her desk to ask about the Brooklyn Sisters file, and she said it was coming along, and he looked at her for a moment with the particular look of someone who is deciding whether to ask a follow-up question and then deciding against it, and moved on. Her phone buzzed. Third message. The courtesy was mostly gone now. He'd heard from a mutual contact. She didn't know what mutual contact. She and Dante had no mutual contacts she was aware of. That she'd been talking about him. He thought that was beneath her. He thought she should consider what she was risking by misrepresenting their relationship to people. She picked up her phone. She was going to call Priya. She had the phone in her hand and Priya's name on the screen, and she was going to call her and tell her everything and accept whatever look came with it, because the alternative was sitting alone with this, and she was very bad at sitting alone with things that frightened her. Her phone buzzed again. Not a text. A call. Unknown number. She stared at it through 2 rings and then answered. Ms. Quinn. Lucian's voice. The same quality as in the restaurant. Level, unrushed, carrying the particular weight of someone who never raised it because they never had to. I understand Moretti has been in contact. She stood up from her desk and walked to the narrow hallway near the emergency exit, away from Garrett and the open plan and the particular quality of office acoustics that made everything audible to everyone. How do you know that? She said. I had someone keeping an eye on his activity. I should have told you I was going to do that. I'm telling you now. She pressed her back against the wall. You had someone watching him, watching his communications, digital activity, nothing that involved you directly. That's a significant thing to do without telling me. Yes, he said. I know. Then why didn't you? Because I wasn't sure it was necessary, and I didn't want to alarm you before I knew whether there was something to be alarmed about. That was the wrong call. I'm correcting it. She exhaled. The hallway smelled of fire retardant and cleaning solution, and the specific institutional quality of emergency exits everywhere. She looked at the red stenciled letters above the door and thought about how strange it was to be having this conversation in this particular location. "What has he been doing?" she said. "Making calls, talking to people in his network about you." A pause. "The characterizations are not flattering. He's telling people things about me. He's telling people a version of what happened that places him as the aggrieved party, which is consistent with the pattern. He did the same with the previous women." Another pause. "There's also been contact with a man named Soren Vallas. I want to know if you recognize that name." She turned the name over. "No." "Vallas runs a firm that specializes in reputation management, among other things. The other things include information acquisition. He's been known to approach people in the periphery of a target's life, coworkers, former colleagues." "He's going to go after my job," she said. It wasn't a question. The pieces arrived in the right order and the conclusion was simply there. Possibly. Or he may just want leverage. Information he can use if you do something that makes it necessary. Either way, I thought you should know. She was quiet for a moment. In her chest, something had shifted, something that had been fear orienting itself into something adjacent to it, but with more edges. "What are my options?" she said. "You have 3, he said. "First, you do nothing. Wait to see what he does, and respond when it becomes concrete. The problem with that is you're reactive and he's ahead of you. Second, you preempt. Go to HR, flag a potential issue with your employer before Vallas does. You control the narrative." He stopped. "Third, you let me handle it." "What does that mean?" "It means I make it clear to Moretti that continuing this particular line of activity has consequences he won't want to navigate. The same way you made it clear at the restaurant." "Yes." She thought about Dante's face in the elevator lobby. The gray exposed quality of it. The way 90 seconds had collapsed everything he'd spent 2 hours constructing. "If I say yes to the third option," she said carefully, "what does that make me?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. "Someone who accepted help," he said. "From you specifically." "From me specifically. And that comes with, I told you before, no conditions. You told me that in a restaurant where you'd just done me a favor, and I had no reason to question whether you meant it. This is a different context." "The answer is the same," he said. "I don't need anything from you, Miss Quinn. I don't operate that way." She laughed. It came out shorter and sharper than she intended, the kind of laugh that isn't really humor. "You're a crime boss, Mr. Devereaux. Whatever way you operate, I'm fairly certain it involves getting things in return for things." A beat. Then, "Yes. With people in my world, you're not in my world." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." She pushed off from the wall. Through the small, wire-reinforced window in the emergency door, she could see the gray sky above the building across the street, heavy with cloud, the kind of sky that couldn't decide between rain and something worse. "I'll call you back," she said. "Take your time." She hung up. She stood in the hallway for another 2 minutes. She thought about option 1 and option 2, and she thought about sitting across from Dante at that table with his hand on her wrist and his voice saying, "You owe me." And she thought about going to HR and having that conversation, trying to explain the shape of what had happened, which had no single dramatic incident at its center, only a long evening of small exactitudes that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. She went back to her desk. She looked at the brand guidelines for the Brooklyn Sisters for approximately 4 minutes. She called Lucien back. "Option 3, she said. "All right? On one condition." "You said I wasn't offering conditions." "You weren't, I am." She kept her voice level. She was very tired of keeping her voice level, but she did it anyway because it was the only way she knew how to have conversations that mattered. "I want to know what happens. I don't want to be kept outside it. If you do something, I want to know what it was." A silence. Not a long one. Maybe 4 seconds. "That's not how I usually work," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the condition." Another pause. "Agreed," he said. She hung up. Her hands were shaking very slightly. She put them flat on the desk and pressed down until the shaking stopped, and then she picked up her coffee and drank what remained of it, even though it was cold. And she looked at the brand guidelines and she thought about what she'd just done. And she didn't allow herself to think about whether it was wise because it was done. She found out what had happened 2 days later. Lucienne called at 8:15 in the morning before she'd left for work, while she was standing in her kitchen in yesterday's clothes because she hadn't been sleeping in the bed. She'd been sleeping on the couch or not sleeping at all. And she answered on the first ring. "Moretti has pulled back," he said. "The contact with Valles has stopped. His communications about you in the last 24 hours are absent." "What did you do?" she said. "I had a conversation with him." "In person?" "Yes." "Where?" "His office. Yesterday afternoon." She put her hand flat on the kitchen counter. Her apartment was quiet around her, the particular quality of morning quiet in a city that never quite got silent, only cycled through gradations of noise. "You went to his office?" "He agreed to meet." "He agreed? Dante agreed to meet with you." "People generally agree to meet with me when I ask," Lucian said, with the same neutral flatness with which he said most things, and she understood that this was not arrogance but simple accuracy, and somehow that was worse, the simplicity of it. "What did you say to him?" "I gave him a clear picture of what I know about his history, the women, the reports that were filed and withdrawn, the business associations." A pause. "I gave him a clear picture of what the consequences would be if he continued to direct any attention, positive or negative, toward you." "You threatened him." "I informed him," Lucian said. "Threats imply uncertainty about follow-through. I don't threaten." She absorbed that. "Is he going to comply?" she said. "For now. Men like Moretti are predictable under the right kind of pressure. They calculate, and right now the calculation says compliance is cheaper than the alternative. That holds as long as he believes the consequences are real. And if he stops believing that, then we have a different conversation." He paused. "I don't expect that to be necessary." She was quiet for a moment. Outside her kitchen window, the sky was the same gray it had been for 4 days, the city doing its quiet winter business in the early morning. "Thank you," she said. A beat. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." Another small silence, and in it she became aware of something she hadn't quite named yet, a quality to the silences and conversations with Lucien Devereaux that was different from silences with other people. Most silences were uncomfortable because they were empty. His weren't empty. They had a texture, a density, something occupying them. "I need to ask you something else," she said. "All right. The sister. The woman 5 years ago." She stopped, then kept going, because she'd already stepped into this. "What happened to her?" The silence this time was longer, not uncomfortable, or it was uncomfortable, but of a different species, the discomfort of weight rather than absence. "She died," he said. 2 words. Same syllable count as "where are you?" from the text in the restaurant bathroom, carrying an entirely different order of gravity. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "It was a long time ago," he said, the same way he'd said it in the restaurant, and she understood now that this was the sentence he'd constructed to allow the subject to close without being dishonest about it, and she let it close. "I should go to work," she said. "Yes." "Lucien." She said his first name, and he heard it, and she heard him hear it. A small shift in the quality of the line, barely anything, but present. "The condition I gave you, knowing what happens, I meant it." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to be easy about this." "I don't expect you to be," he said. And then, after a pause, "Ms. Quinn." "Alara," she said. Another pause. "Alara." He said it like he was placing it somewhere carefully. "I'll be in touch." He hung up. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment with her phone in her hand and the morning going gray and ordinary around her, and she thought about what she'd agreed to. Not in any specific, articulable sense. There was no agreement to point to, no contract, nothing a reasonable person could look at and call a decision. But the shape of the thing was visible to her the same way the shape of a building is visible before you can see the building itself. The way light changes before the source of it arrives. She'd been in the ordinary world 3 days ago. She wasn't anymore. She went to change her clothes and tried not to think about how thoroughly she'd just handed the threat of something to a man she did not know, operating in a world she could not see, on the basis of 11 minutes of conversation and a car that appeared at the curb in 4 minutes, and the way he'd said I was late once with 5 words carrying the weight of 5 years. She was very good at telling herself she was fine. She told herself she was fine. She got on the subway and went to work and sat at her desk and opened the brand guidelines for the Brooklyn Sisters, and she did not check her phone for 45 minutes, which was the longest she'd managed in 3 days. At 11:17, her work email received a forwarded message from Garrett with the subject line, "Heads up, anonymous review." She opened it. Someone had posted a review on a professional platform, the kind where clients rated designers and firms, under a pseudonym she didn't recognize, describing a working experience with her that had never happened. The language was specific, detailed. It described missed deadlines, unprofessional communication, a pattern of unreliability. All of it fabricated. All of it written in the register of someone who knew exactly what details made a lie feel like a record. She forwarded it to Lucian without text. His reply came in 4 minutes. Moretti. Then 30 seconds later, "Don't respond to it. I'll handle the platform." This is a reaction. He's scared. Scared men do small things. She stared at the word scared, applied to Dante Moretti, and felt something cold settle into the space behind her sternum. She typed back, "He's not going to stop." 3 dots. Then, "No, not on his own." She set the phone down. She thought about Lucien in Dante's office yesterday afternoon. She thought about the specific quality of whatever conversation had happened there. Lucien's version of a conversation, which she was beginning to understand was its own category of thing, a thing that involved a kind of pressure most conversations didn't carry. She thought about the way Dante had looked in the elevator lobby at the restaurant. Gray, exposed, small. She thought about him scared and doing small things, and what came after small things when they didn't work. She thought about the fact that she had now placed herself, with full awareness, in the orbit of a man whose name alone changed the behavior of everyone in the room when he walked into it, and that she had no framework for what that meant going forward, and that the frameworks she did have, the ones she'd built from growing up in a managed household and working in a profession that rewarded careful, controlled output, were not equipped for this particular landscape. Her phone buzzed. Lucien again. "One line, there's something you need to know about Moretti's business history. Can you meet tonight?" She looked at the message. She looked at the brand guidelines on her screen, the careful typography, the sustainable palette. The 2 sisters in Brooklyn who ran a clean and decent business and had no idea any of this existed. She typed back, "Where?" His reply was an address and a time, and below it 3 words that arrived with the specific weight of something that was no longer preventable. "It's more complicated." She stared at those 3 words and understood, with the clean, cold clarity of someone who has just recognized the exact moment a door closed behind them, that the next time she saw Lucien Devereaux, it would not be the same as the last time, because the last time she'd still been able to tell herself this was temporary, a coincidence, a single evening with a defined edge. And tonight was going to remove that last comfortable fiction and replace it with something that had no edge she could see from where she was standing. She typed, "I'll be there." She hit send. And somewhere across the city, in an office or a car, or a room she'd never seen and might never see, Dante Moretti was doing something small and scared and calculating, and the thing he was calculating was how to make her pay for the evening at Velvet Meridian, and he had just found the piece of information he'd been looking for. The piece that changed everything. And he didn't know yet that finding it was the worst mistake he would. The address Lucien had sent was not a restaurant. It was a building in the West 30s, the kind of building that had no signage, and a lobby that looked like it belonged to an accounting firm. Gray marble, minimal lighting, a single security desk with a man behind it who looked at Alara when she pushed through the glass door and said nothing, just picked up a phone and said 2 words into it, and then nodded at the elevator bank to his left. She rode up to the 14th floor alone. The elevator was slow and quiet, and she stood in it with her coat buttoned to the top and her bag against her side, and she thought about the message, "It's more complicated," and the specific quality of those 3 words, which had been bothering her since 11:17 that morning with the specific low-grade frequency of a sound you can't locate. The doors opened. A woman was waiting. Late 30s, sharp-featured, dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had decided years ago that appearance was a tool rather than a performance. She was dressed well but not expensively, the kind of well that meant she'd chosen each piece with a specific purpose. She looked at Alara with the direct, unreadable assessment of someone who had made their professional living reading people quickly and accurately. "Miss Quinn," she said, "I'm Serafina Devereaux, Lucien's sister. Come in." The room beyond was large and functional. A conference table, several chairs, a whiteboard on one wall with nothing on it, windows facing north. Lucien was standing at the far end of the table. He was not alone. There was a man seated to his left, older, compact, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned patience the hard way, and a second man standing near the window, younger, who looked at Alara when she entered and then immediately looked at Lucien, checking something. Lucien said, "Sit down." She sat. Serafina sat across from her. The older man didn't move. The younger man stayed at the window. Lucien remained standing. 3 hours ago, he said without preamble, one of my people intercepted a communication between Dante Moretti and a federal contact. She heard the word federal, and something in her chest went very still. Moretti has been a cooperating witness, Lucien continued, for a federal financial crimes investigation. Has been for approximately 14 months. The room was quiet. Alara looked at him. She was aware of Serafina across the table and the two men in her peripheral vision and the particular texture of the silence in the room, which had the density of something that had been building before she arrived and was now simply present. "Cooperating against who?" she said. "Several parties," Lucien said. "One of them is me." She absorbed that. She absorbed it the way you absorb something your nervous system recognizes before your mind does. A full-body understanding that arrived before the language to describe it, sitting in her sternum like a struck chord still resonating. "He came after me," she said, "because of you." "We don't know that yet," Lucien said. "What we know is that the timing is—" "He targeted me 3 weeks before our first date," she said. "You told me that yourself. He ran a background check on me. If he'd been building a case against you for over a year and he found out somehow that your number was connected to me—" She stopped. The logic was assembling itself faster than she wanted it to. "He didn't find me randomly." Lucien said nothing. "He found me because of you," she said. The older man at the table moved for the first time, shifted his weight, a small adjustment, the kind that meant something in a room where people were trained to be still. "We don't have confirmation of the connection yet," Serafina said. Her voice was level, but carried a different quality than Lucien's. Less controlled, more precise, like someone who had learned to manage heat rather than eliminate it. "What we know is that Moretti has been feeding information to a federal handler for 14 months. We know that 3 of the last 6 targets of that investigation had incidental contact with Lucien's operations. We know Moretti has been trying to get close to someone in Lucien's peripheral network for—" "I'm not in his network," Alara said. "No," Serafina said. "You're not." "Then how did—" "Your number," Lucien said. "When you sent the message. Moretti apparently had access to a directory, a private one, the kind that shouldn't exist but does, that cross-referenced the number you accidentally contacted with my name." He paused. "We think he already knew about that number before your text arrived. We think he'd been building toward a reason to access it. So when I texted you," Alara said slowly, "he already knew. And when you came to the restaurant, he saw exactly what he needed to see," Lucien said. She looked at the table in front of her, at the grain of the wood, which was real, which was a solid and concrete thing, in a room where everything else had just become unreliable. "He photographed the encounter," she said. It wasn't a question. She knew, the same way she'd known that something was wrong at the restaurant before she could articulate it. "Yes," Lucien said, "and filed it." "Yes." "So I am—" She stopped, started again. "I am now in a federal investigations documentation as a known associate of— as a person of interest in relation to," Lucien said. "Not an associate. The distinction matters legally." "It matters enormously less than you're making it sound," she said. His jaw moved, a small movement, the kind that happened when someone was choosing not to say the thing they were about to say. You're right, he said. It does. She stood up. She didn't do it dramatically, she simply stood because sitting felt wrong, felt like submission to the shape of what was happening, and she needed the physical reality of being upright in the room. 3 weeks, she said. He spent 3 weeks building a connection with me so that when you responded to my text, he could document you leaving your car and entering a restaurant and speaking with a woman he'd pre-established as a, what? A business contact? An asset? What did he tell them I was? We don't know the exact characterization, Serafina said. Take a guess? A small silence. Someone you were involved with, Lucien said. Personally. The word personally sat in the room. Elara looked at him. She looked at him with the specific quality of attention that arrives when you have been used as a tool without your knowledge, and the anger that came with it wasn't hot. It was cold. The deep cold of something that had gone past heat into the temperature on the other side. You need to tell me everything, she said. Right now. All of it. Not the version that protects me from details. Everything. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down and began to talk. What followed was 40 minutes that she would think about for a long time afterward. Not with clarity exactly, but with the specific sensory texture of a thing that changed the shape of your understanding permanently. He talked about the investigation, what he knew of it, and what he'd been able to piece together since 3 hours ago. He talked about Moretti's arrangement with the federal handler, a woman named Cross, Organized Crime Division, apparently meticulous and patient and very good at running cooperating witnesses over long periods. He talked about the 3 targets before Elara, what Moretti had done with each of them, how the pattern worked, establish proximity to a peripheral figure, manufacture a visible connection, document the connection in a way that could be construed as evidence of the central target's associations. He talked about what Elara's face in that documentation meant for the case being built. He did not soften it. She'd asked him not to soften it, and he didn't. When he finished, the room was very quiet. The younger man at the window had moved to sit down at some point during the 40 minutes. The older man had poured water from a pitcher on the table and placed a glass in front of Elara without comment, and she'd drunk half of it without noticing. The documentations they have, she said, the photograph of you at the restaurant. What else? Moretti kept records of your 3 dates, Lucien said. Check-ins, timestamps, location data. He was tracking me during our dates. Yes. The whole time. Yes. She put her hand flat on the table. The surface was cool and solid. She pressed down. My work email, she said, the review this morning. Designed to look like retaliation, Lucien said, from you. To anyone reading it as a narrative, look, she's destabilizing him publicly. She's acting in coordination with you, she said. Yes. He didn't do it because he was scared, she said. He did it because it fit the story he's building. Lucien said nothing, which was the answer. She looked at Serafina. What's the actual legal exposure? For me specifically. Serafina's expression shifted. Not much, but enough to read. Technically minimal, right now. You haven't done anything. You were approached, you went on dates, you sent a text by mistake. None of that is actionable. But the question is what the investigation decides to do with the documentation they already have. If they decide you're useful as leverage, someone they can approach, someone who has ongoing contact with. I don't have ongoing contact, Elara said. I've met him twice. The silence that followed was a different shape than the previous silences. Elara, Serafina said, and the use of her first name without having asked for permission to use it was its own kind of information. The communication we intercepted tonight, Moretti's message to his federal handler. Something moved in Elara's chest. What was in it? She said. Serafina looked at Lucien. Lucien said, he told them he had an asset, someone in close proximity to me who had demonstrated willingness to maintain contact. He paused. He described you as cooperative. The word landed. Cooperative. Elara sat very still. The water glass was still in her hand and she set it down because her grip on it had tightened to the point where she was aware of the pressure against her palm. He told them I was helping him, she said. He told them you were a viable approach vector, Lucien said. Cooperative doesn't necessarily mean. He told them I was his, she said. After 3 weeks of manufacturing a relationship with me and then documenting your response to my accidental text, he told a federal investigation that I was a cooperating source. Her voice was very level. She was aware of how level it was, aware that the levelness was structural, holding something up. Without my knowledge, without my consent. He built a file using my life and my face and my name and handed it to a federal investigation and told them I was on his side. Yes, Lucian said. She looked at her hands on the table. They were not shaking. She was surprised by that. She would have expected them to shake. If the investigation accepts that characterization, she said, and they approach me, you're in a position where any response looks like confirmation, Serafina said. You deny it. You look defensive. You don't respond. You look complicit by silence. You cooperate with them. You're actively working against... She stopped. Against you, Alara said, looking at Lucian. He held her gaze. Yes. And you need me not to cooperate with them. I need you to understand the full picture, he said. What you do with it is your decision. Is it? She said. Is it actually my decision, or is it my decision in the sense that you've presented it as a decision while the actual parameters have already been set by other people? Something moved in his face. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger. That's a fair question, he said. Answer it. He was quiet for a moment. There are constraints, he said. There are constraints I can't eliminate. Moretti has created a situation where your available options are limited, she said. Yes. Because of you. A beat. Because of me, he said. The room absorbed that. She stood up again. She walked to the window, the one the younger man had vacated, and looked out at the city. It was dark now, full dark. The city doing its evening work below her, all those lit windows with all those ordinary problems behind them. She thought about her apartment, about the couch where she'd been sleeping, about the brand guidelines for the Brooklyn sisters, which she'd been genuinely excited about a week ago, which felt now like a photograph of somewhere she'd been once. She thought about Dante's hand on her wrist. She thought about Lucien in her kitchen that morning. Not physically. He hadn't been there, but his voice through the phone, level and unrushed, saying scared men do small things. She turned around. The 14 months he's been cooperating, she said. What has he given them? Lucian looked at her with the focused quality of someone recalibrating. Financial records, he said, routing structures, some personnel information. Has anyone been arrested? Not yet. So the investigation is still building? Yes. Which means what he's given them so far isn't enough, she said. Which means what he's trying to do now, creating documentation of your associations, manufacturing cooperating sources, is because what he has isn't sufficient and he needs more. The older man at the table moved again. He and Lucien exchanged a look with the compressed efficiency of people who had been communicating nonverbally for a long time. Yes, Lucian said. So his position is weaker than yours, she said. Right now. Right now. What changes that? If the investigation decides the documentation he's provided is sufficient to move on, or if he produces something new, something concrete. Lucian paused. Something like a credible source with direct access. Someone like me, she said. No one in the room said anything. She understood then, fully, completely, with the cold clarity of someone standing in a wind they can't turn away from, that the moment she'd sent that text in the restaurant bathroom was not the moment her life had changed. She'd told herself it was. She'd drawn the line there, at that coincidence, that misdialed number, the stranger who'd answered. The moment her life had changed was this one, because 3 weeks ago she'd been a variable Dante Moretti was managing, and last week she'd become a peripheral figure in a federal investigation she'd never agreed to enter. And tonight she was sitting in a room with a man whose empire was under serious threat, and he had just told her, not in words, but in every word he'd chosen and every word he hadn't, that the next move in this was hers, not her decision in the abstract sense he'd offered it. Her decision in the specific consequential sense that what she did next determined the shape of everything that followed, for her, for him, for the investigation that had her name in a file somewhere as cooperative. She looked at Lucien Devereaux. She said, "You need me to meet with Moretti." The room was absolutely silent. Lucien's face did not change. "No," he said. "You need me to meet with him and let him believe the characterization he gave to the investigation is accurate," she said. "You need me to be what he told them I was, so that what he feeds them goes through me, and what goes through me can be managed." "Alara." "That's what the picture looks like," she said. "That's the play. You don't have a source inside the information flow between Moretti and the investigation. If I become that source—" "I'm not asking you to do that," Lucien said, and his voice had changed, not in volume, but in something below volume, something in the load-bearing structure of it. "I know you're not asking," she said. "I'm telling you that's the option you haven't put on the table because you've decided I shouldn't have to choose it." He stood up. He walked to the window and stood beside her, not close, 2 feet of space between them, and they both looked at the city, and she was acutely aware of his presence, the way you are aware of heat from a fire that isn't touching you. "If Moretti believes you're what he told them you are," Lucien said quietly, "and you maintain that, and something goes wrong, if the investigation moves faster than we can manage, or if Moretti realizes what's happening, you are not protected by anything I can offer in time to matter." "I know that." "Alara, I know that," she said again. "I'm not asking you to protect me from consequences. I'm telling you I understand the picture, and I'm making a decision about it." He turned his head and looked at her profile. She didn't look back at him. She kept looking at the city. "Why?" he said. It was a real question, not rhetorical, not strategic. The genuine question of a man who could not fully compute the variable in front of him. She thought about it honestly, about what the honest answer was, and whether she was willing to say it out loud in this room with these people. "Because he used my face," she said, "without asking, without my knowledge. He built a story with my face in it and handed it to people who now have my name in a file, and I did not consent to any of it." She paused. "And because you came to that restaurant—" Silence. "You didn't have to come," she said. "You could have read that text and put your phone back in your pocket and gone on with your evening, and I would never have known. But you came, and I have been trying to understand why, and the only answer I keep arriving at is that you came because you thought it was the right thing to do, and that is—" She stopped. "That is not something I know how to walk away from when someone needs the same thing in return." The city burned below them. Lucien said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You'd need to be prepared. Everything about Moretti, how he operates, what he's looking for, how to give him something that reads as real without being actionable." She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd stood up. "Then prepare me." They gave her 6 days. 6 days in that building in the West 30s, in a room 2 floors below the conference room where she'd made the decision, a room that had a cot and a whiteboard, and a table with 4 chairs and windows that looked at a brick wall 12 feet away. Serafina ran most of the sessions. The older man, his name was Carver, she learned, just Carver, no first name offered or requested, ran the others. Lucien was present for some of it and absent for the rest. And when he was present, he sat at the edge of the room and listened and said very little. And when he wasn't present, she was aware of his absence the way you are aware of a sound stopping. Serafina was precise, methodical, and completely without sentimentality about what they were preparing Alara to do. "Moretti reads hesitation as deception," she said on the second day. "If you pause before answering, he'll hear the pause louder than the answer, so you don't pause. You answer before you finish deciding, and you let the answer be slightly imperfect. Imperfect reads as honest. Rehearsed reads as—" "Rehearsed," Alara said. "Yes. So I have to be imperfect in a way that isn't itself rehearsed." Serafina looked at her. "You understand it." "I grew up managing a difficult person," Alara said. "I understand the mechanics." Something shifted in Serafina's face. Not sympathy, but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who had learned similar mechanics in a different house. They didn't discuss it further. By day 4, Alara could describe Lucien's fictional business interest in a waterfront development project, the cover story they'd constructed, the reason Moretti would believe she'd become a genuine source, with the flat, slightly reluctant quality of someone giving up information they weren't sure they should be giving up. She could do it tired. She could do it while Carver asked her aggressive questions designed to destabilize her narrative. She could do it with her hands in her lap instead of on the table, which Serafina had identified as her tell. When she was uncertain, she put her hands on the table, pressing down, the same gesture she made when she needed something solid. She stopped putting her hands on the table. On day 5, Lucian ran the session. He sat across from her, and he was Dante. Not a performance, not theatrical, but functionally Dante, asking the questions Dante would ask, using the quality of attention Dante used, and she understood after the first 10 minutes that Lucian knew exactly how Dante operated because he had spent time understanding him, and the understanding was not abstract. It was specific and cold and very thorough. She held through the full session. At the end of it, Lucian sat back and looked at her and said, "You're ready." "You're not going to tell me I did well," she said. "You did what was needed," he said. "Telling you it was good introduces a quality I don't want you calibrating against when you're in the room with him." She looked at him. "When I'm in the room with him," she said, "are you going to be close?" "Yes." "How close?" "Close enough," he said. "That's not a number." "No," he said. "It's a promise." She held his gaze for a moment. 3 feet of table between them and 6 days of the most concentrated and unusual education of her life behind her, and something in the room that had been accumulating since that first night at Velvet Meridian, something neither of them had named or addressed, sitting in the space between them with the patient, heavy quality of something that had decided it could wait. "After this is over," she said. "Yes," he said. Before she finished the sentence, she didn't finish it. She didn't need to. The meeting with Dante was set for day 7. It was Dante's suggestion, which was the point. They'd allowed the approach to come from him, a careful, calculated series of signals that let him believe he was moving on his own timetable. A message through a mutual adjacent contact, carefully routed, suggesting she was open to talking. Not about reconciliation, about the situation, about Lucien Devereaux and what she knew about him. Dante had responded within 20 minutes. The location was a hotel bar in Midtown. His choice, which was also the point. Public but private. The kind of ambient noise that made recording difficult. He thought. Elara wore a gray dress and low heels and nothing in her hair. And she arrived 4 minutes late because Serafina had told her arriving exactly on time, read as controlled, and controlled read as prepared. And she walked to the bar where Dante was already seated on a stool, nursing something amber, and she sat down beside him and said, "You look tired." He did look tired. He also looked wary in the specific way of a man who was managing several operational layers simultaneously and was not fully confident in any of them. The Polish was still there. The good suit, the careful grooming, but underneath it something had frayed, the edges of his composure not quite flush the way they'd been at Velvet Meridian. "You came," he said. "I'm here," she said. "I wasn't sure you would be." "I wasn't sure either." She flagged the bartender, ordered a club soda with lime, let him read whatever he wanted into the choice. "You said you had something to tell me." "I said I wanted to talk," he said, "about Devereaux." A small pause. "Among other things." "Then let's talk about Devereaux," she said. She watched him recalibrate. He'd expected more resistance, more maneuvering, and the directness had displaced him slightly, which was the intention. She gave him a moment to settle into the new position, and then she said, "I'm not happy about what's happened to me in the last 2 weeks, Dante. I want you to understand that." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry about—" "I don't need the apology," she said flatly. "I need to understand what I've walked into." His eyes moved over her face. She kept her expression at the specific register Serafina had coached. Not fully open, not guarded, somewhere in the territory of someone who was frightened and trying to manage it through information gathering, which was, she acknowledged internally, not entirely a performance. "What do you know about him?" Dante said. "I know what anyone knows," she said. "Rumors." "And what do the rumors say?" "That he's not someone you want to have a reason to notice you." She paused. Let the pause sit for exactly the right length of time. "I'm starting to think I gave him a reason." Dante's attention sharpened. She could feel it without looking directly at him, the way you feel a change in air pressure. "What kind of reason?" he said. "The night at the restaurant," she said. "He gave me his card. I didn't think anything of it. I thought it was— I don't know what I thought. That he was being courteous." She picked up her club soda, set it down without drinking. "He's called me twice since then." Dante was very still. "What does he want?" Dante said. He asks questions about you, she said. The silence that followed had a specific texture. She could feel him processing, fitting this new information against the architecture he'd built, checking it for structural consistency, looking for the seam where it might not hold. What kind of questions? He said. Business questions. He acts like it's casual, but it isn't. She looked at her glass. He mentioned a development project, something on the waterfront. He seemed to think you'd know about it. Dante set his drink down. His hand on the bar was very controlled. She noticed the signet ring, the same one she'd noticed at Velvet Meridian, and had the same response to it she'd had then. Not to the ring, but to the certainty of the hand wearing it. The Harlow development, Dante said. Quiet, almost to himself. She didn't respond to that. She let it sit. He asked you about the Harlow development, Dante said. He didn't use a name, she said. He described it. Waterfront. Phase 2 financing. Dante picked up his drink and drained what remained of it and set the glass down with the particular precision of someone exercising control over a small object because larger things were not available to exercise control over. Elara, he said, I need you to listen to me carefully. I'm listening. Devereaux is not someone you should be having any contact with. Whatever he's told you, whatever reason he's given you for the calls, he hasn't given me a reason, she said. That's the problem. He just asks, and I don't know how to not answer him. She let something into her voice, not fear, but the texture adjacent to it, the kind of uncertainty that reads as genuine because it was rooted in something genuine. He has a way of, I don't know how to explain it. He doesn't threaten you. He just makes it very clear that he's paying attention, and somehow that's enough. Dante looked at her for a long moment. She held it, hands in her lap, eyes on her glass and then back to him, direct but not challenging, the look of someone trying to figure out who to trust in a situation they didn't fully understand. If I tell you something, Dante said, you have to understand it doesn't leave this conversation. Okay, she said. Devereaux is under investigation, he said. Federal. Financial crimes and related activities. It's been running for over a year. He paused. I know this because I'm part of it. She let the silence extend for 3 full seconds. Then she said, You're working with the federal government. I've been providing information, yes. About Devereaux. About several people. He's the primary. She looked at her glass. She thought about what her face needed to do, which was absorb this as new information, as something alarming and significant that she hadn't known, which was in one sense entirely true, and in every other sense the most precisely prepared moment of the last 6 days. And he's calling me, she said. Yes. Because he knows about you, she said. He knows you're involved and he's trying to use me to get to me, Dante said. Yes. His voice had taken on a quality she hadn't heard before. Not the smooth performance of the restaurant, not the controlled coldness of his texts. Something more exposed. The quality of a man who needed something and was calculating the cost of asking for it. Which is why I need to know exactly what he's asked you, everything, as specifically as you can remember. She looked at him. And in return, she said, his eyes moved. In return, you're protected. I can document that you were approached, that you reported it, that you cooperated with the investigation. Whatever Devereaux thinks he has on you, he doesn't have anything on me, she said. He will try to, Dante said. That's how he works. He builds proximity and then he uses it. But if you're on the record as a cooperating witness, she said. It protects you legally, he said. You're on the right side of this. She looked at her hands. At the bar surface in front of her, the slight dampness from her glass, the ordinary Saturday afternoon quality of a hotel bar doing its ambient business around them. She thought about Serafina saying, imperfect reads as honest. She said, I need to think about it. Ilaris, I need a day, she said. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to think. She picked up her bag. I'll call you tomorrow. Don't call Devereaux, he said. Before you call me. Don't contact him. I wasn't planning to, she said, and stood up, and the specific quality of the lie, true in direction, false in substance, accurate in its implication while inverted in its meaning, sat in her chest with the cold, focused weight of something she had decided to carry. She walked out of the hotel bar without looking back. On the street, the city was doing its early evening business. She walked half a block north and turned into a parking garage and took the elevator to the third level, and Serafina was there, leaning against a gray sedan, arms crossed, and behind her the older man Carver was on a phone, and parked 12 feet further was a second car, and Lucienne was standing beside it. She walked to him. "The Harlow development," she said. He confirmed it. "When I named the waterfront, he said that name. He didn't mean to." Lucien's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle reorientation, like a building settling. "He wants me to be a formal cooperating witness," she said. "Official. On the record." "If you do that—" "I know what it means," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "He's more scared than you thought. The Harlow connection." "What is it?" Lucienne was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's where the financial architecture is most exposed. If they can prove I have a direct interest in that project, it opens the rest of the structure to examination." "Do you have a direct interest?" "A beat." "It's complicated," he said. "Is it actually complicated?" she said. "Or is it the kind of complicated that means yes?" His jaw moved. "The second kind," he said. She absorbed that. The parking garage around them smelled of oil and concrete and the particular cold of enclosed spaces at night, and somewhere on the level below them, a car alarm was going in short, frustrated pulses. "Then we don't have as much time as we thought," she said. "No. If he reports this conversation tonight, which he will, his handler is going to push him to move faster. Get me on record. Make the source official before they move on the project." "Yes. How long do we have?" Carver lowered his phone. He and Lucienne exchanged the compressed nonverbal communication she'd seen in the conference room, and then Carver said, 48 hours. Maybe less. She looked at Lucienne. "So whatever you're going to do about the investigation, about Cross and the documentation Moretti has already provided, it has to happen in 48 hours. "Yes." "Tell me what happens in 48 hours, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The parking garage light above them was the fluorescent color of institutional spaces, unflattering, indifferent, and in it his face was stripped of the ambient quality that good lighting gave it, reduced to its actual components, tired around the eyes, controlled along the jaw, carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who had been managing something very large for a very long time and was approaching a moment where the management was no longer sufficient. "I have a meeting," he said, "tomorrow night, with 3 people who have the ability to make Cross's investigation disappear." She stared at him. "Disappear?" "Redirect," he said. "Provide them with a more significant target. Something that makes pursuing me less valuable than pursuing something else." "What's the more significant target?" He held her gaze. "Moretti's handler," he said. "Cross. She's been running cooperating witnesses for 14 months in an organized crime investigation. What she hasn't disclosed to her superiors is that 2 of those witnesses, not Moretti, 2 others, have been making payments to a private account registered to a family member of hers." He paused. "It's not conclusive yet, but with the right presentation to the right people, it's enough to redirect everything." The car alarm below them stopped. The silence was very complete. "You've had this," she said. "The information about Cross." "We've been developing it," he said, "for 5 months. "Then why—" She stopped. The answer was arriving before she finished the question. "You needed Moretti to move. You needed him to escalate. You needed him to make a provable action that connected him directly to Cross's operation as something other than a passive source." She looked at him. "You needed me to be in that bar tonight so he would escalate." The pause before he answered was very small. "Yes," he said. She turned away. She took 3 steps toward the elevator and stopped. Her hands were in her coat pockets, and her jaw was tight, and she stood there for a moment with the weight of it. Not the betrayal exactly, because it wasn't that simple. Nothing in the last 2 weeks had been that simple. But the specific discomfort of understanding that she had been, again, a piece moved on a board she hadn't been shown fully. "Alara," he said. "Don't," she said. "I didn't know. When you first texted, I didn't know who you were or that Moretti was—" "I know that, she said. "I know that part." She turned around. Her voice was very level and very cold, and she was aware of Serafina and Carver in her peripheral vision, not moving, not speaking, doing the careful stillness of people who understood the temperature of the room. The part I'm talking about is the part where you let me sit in that bar tonight with him believing the whole operation was my decision. She looked at him directly. Was there any version of tonight where I wasn't going to be in that bar? He held her gaze and he didn't look away, and he said, "No." She nodded. One sharp movement. "The meeting tomorrow night," she said. "The 3 people who can redirect the investigation. They'll want the recording from tonight?" "Yes?" "Among other things." "What other things?" "Your testimony," he said. "If it comes to that. Formal statement that Moretti approached you, represented himself as a cooperating federal witness, solicited your participation in a way that compromised my safety," she said. "Yes." She stood in the fluorescent light of the parking garage and looked at the man across from her, at the exhaustion in his face, and the control that lived beside it, and the 5 months of developing information about a corrupt federal agent, and the 48-hour window that had just opened and was already closing. And she thought about the card he'd given her at the restaurant, plain white with a number on it, and the car at the curb in 4 minutes, and I was late once. I don't intend to be late again. She thought about the woman 5 years ago. She thought about what it cost to be the kind of person who came anyway. "The meeting tomorrow night," she said. "I want to be there." "Ilara, I'm the testimony," she said. "I'm the source. If those 3 people need a face to put on this, they should see mine, not hear about it through you." She took a step toward him. "And I want to be in the room when it happens, because I am done being outside rooms while other people decide what my involvement means." Lucien looked at her. Behind him, Carver made a sound that might have been the beginning of an objection, and Serafina made a different sound that clearly meant don't. "The room tomorrow night," Lucien said quietly, "is not a safe room." "I know. The people in it. I know what kind of people they are," she said. "I've been in a building for 6 days learning what kind of world this is. I'm not operating on assumptions anymore." He was close enough that she could see the specific quality of his eyes in the bad light. The dark steadiness she'd noticed at the restaurant, worn thinner now. The steadiness costing something it hadn't cost 8 days ago. "If something goes wrong in that room," he said, "I cannot guarantee." "I'm not asking you to guarantee anything," she said. "I'm telling you I'm going to be there." The city pressed in around the building. 48 hours sat between now and whatever tomorrow night was going to be. Somewhere across town, Dante Moretti was calling his federal handler, and Agent Cross was receiving the information from the hotel bar, and a series of operational decisions were being made by people who thought they controlled the board. Lucien looked at her for a long, measured moment. Then he said, "All right." He turned and said something to Carver in a voice too low to hear, and Carver nodded once and moved away with his phone. And Serafina came and stood near Ilara and said quietly, "I'll go over the room with you tonight. Who will be there? What to expect?" "Thank you," Ilara said. Lucien was already moving toward the car. He stopped with his hand on the door and turned back, and across 12 feet of concrete and bad light, and the residue of everything the last 8 days had put between them, he looked at her with an expression that was not controlled, not precisely, that had something in it she hadn't seen before in his face, something that looked like the thing a person carries when they've made their decisions and lived with them for a long time, and are standing in front of the one variable they didn't calculate. He said, "I'm glad you answered the text." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He got in the car. 41 hours later, in a room on the 22nd floor of a building she'd never been to, with 3 people whose names she was told once and would not repeat, with a recording from a hotel bar and 5 months of financial documentation, and her own voice saying clearly and without hesitation what had happened to her and why and when. The investigation into Lucien Devereaux was formally redirected at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, and nobody shook hands. That was the thing Ilara remembered afterward, in the specific inventory of details that lodged themselves in memory after a high-pressure event. Not the dramatic moments, not the statements she delivered or the documents passed across the table, but the absence of ceremony at the end of it. The 3 people who had the authority to move the machinery of a federal investigation simply gathered their materials and left the room through different doors, and the room was quiet. And that was that. She sat in her chair for a moment after they left. Serafina was at the window, phone in hand, running communications Ilara couldn't hear. Carver was at the door. Lucien stood at the far end of the table, still, looking at the wall above where the three people had been sitting, and his face had the quality of a man standing in the aftermath of something large. Not relief, not triumph, something more exhausted and more honest than either of those. She said, "Is it done?" He turned and looked at her. "The redirection is done," he said. "The rest takes time." "How much time?" "Weeks," he said. "Months for some of it. The Harlow project will be examined. There will be questions. My financial structure needs to be adjusted in ways that will take—" He stopped. "It's not simple. It doesn't resolve cleanly. But the investigation into you specifically is no longer the primary focus," he said. "Yes." She nodded. She was very tired. She'd been tired since the parking garage the previous night, a bone-level exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the accumulated weight of 9 days of sustained tension, the kind of tired that arrived after the thing you'd been braced for had finally happened and your body understood it could stop bracing. "And Dante," she said. Lucien's expression shifted. Not dramatically, a small contained movement along the jaw. "Cross will be placed under internal investigation," he said. "When that happens, her cooperating witnesses lose their protected status until the investigation concludes. Moretti is aware of this. He's been aware of it since—" He paused. "Since about an hour ago. Someone told him." "Someone told him," Lucien confirmed. She thought about Dante Moretti and whatever room he was in at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, receiving the information that the architecture he'd spent 14 months constructing had developed a catastrophic structural fault. She thought about the gray, exposed quality of his face in the elevator lobby at Velvet Meridian. She thought about his hand on her wrist and the word cooperative in a federal document and the fake review posted to the professional platform and the 3 women before her, 2 of whom had withdrawn their reports and 1 of whom had moved to another city. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly. It was something more complicated than satisfaction, less clean, weighted with the knowledge of what it had cost to get here. "What happens to him?" she said. "Without Cross's protection and with the communications record we've provided to the right people, his business associations will be examined on their own merits. Several of them won't survive that examination." Lucien paused. "He won't be prosecuted for what he did to you personally. The legal mechanism for that doesn't exist in a way that's accessible." "I know," she said. "I want to be clear that I know," she said again, more firmly. "I know you can't fix all of it. I'm not asking you to." She looked at him across the long table. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm telling you I understand the limits." He held her gaze. "Come on," Serafina said from the window, not unkindly. "Car's downstairs." They rode down in the elevator in silence, the 4 of them, Ilara and Lucien and Serafina and Carver, and the silence had a different quality than the silences that had preceded it, less pressurized, less loaded with operational necessity. Just tired people in an elevator at midnight. On the street, Carver peeled away with a nod that was the most expressive thing she'd seen him do. Serafina hugged her, which surprised her. A brief, firm embrace that carried no sentiment but considerable sincerity. The hug of someone who did not hug easily and was doing it because they meant it. "You were good in there," Serafina said quietly. "All of it. The whole week." Ilara said, "Thank you for preparing me." "You prepared yourself," Serafina said. "I just gave you the structure." She looked at her brother, then back at Ilara, with an expression that managed to be simultaneously unreadable and completely clear. Then she got in a car, and it drove away. Lucien said, "I'll have someone—" "I want to walk," Ilara said. He looked at her. It was close to midnight, and they were in Midtown, and the streets were not empty, but they were thinned out. The city in its post-theater, post-dinner configuration, cabs and couples, and the occasional cluster of noise from a late-closing bar. "I'll walk with you," he said. She didn't tell him not to. They walked for 4 blocks without speaking. Her heels were wrong for it, but she didn't care, and the cold was sharp enough to be clarifying, and the city moved around them with its usual indifference to whatever any individual person had just been through. After the 4th block, she said, "Tell me about her." He didn't ask who she meant. He was quiet for half a block. She didn't push it. She walked beside him and waited. and the city provided ambient sound to fill the space while he decided. Her name was Mara, he said. She was 24. She'd been with someone for 2 years. A man in my peripheral world, not someone I'd brought in, someone who'd come in through other channels. I knew she was unhappy. I didn't know how unhappy. He paused. She sent the message to my number because it was the only one she had access to. Her phone had been taken. She used someone else's. He stopped walking for a moment, then started again. I was 30 minutes away. I drove fast. It wasn't fast enough. The street they were on was quieter, a cross street between avenues, the particular hush of mid-block in a city that was never entirely hushed. What happened to the man? She said. He's not available to hurt anyone else, Lucian said, with the flat, final quality of a sentence that was not an elaboration and was not going to become one. She absorbed that and didn't ask him to expand it. You've been carrying her, she said. For 5 years. Yes. And when my text came through, I didn't think about it rationally, he said. There was no rational component to the first 60 seconds. I was moving before I decided to move. He looked ahead of them at the street. The rational component came later, when I was already in the car. What did the rational component say? That this was probably nothing, a misdial, a drunk person, a teenager testing something, that I was about to drive across the city for a stranger's inconvenience. He paused. I drove anyway. She walked beside him and thought about the 60 seconds before rational arrived. The 60 seconds when a man who operated in a world built on calculation and precision had simply moved without deciding to, and she thought about what that meant about the shape of guilt and the way it lived in a person over 5 years, the way it didn't leave but redistributed itself into the body's automatic functions until it became indistinguishable from instinct. She would have been glad, Alara said. Mara, that you came for me. Lucian said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I think so too. They walked another 2 blocks. She could see the lights of her neighborhood beginning to organize themselves in the direction they were heading, the particular constellation of bodegas and laundromats, and the Thai place on the corner that was always open. The Harlow Project, she said. You told me it was complicated in the way that meant yes. Yes. Are you going to be all right? She said. Not with it, just all right. He considered it, which she appreciated. He didn't give her the fast, easy answer. Some things will have to change, he said. The financial structure, some of the operations. Certain relationships that have been useful will become more complicated when the investigation reshuffles. He paused. I've been in positions of similar pressure before. I know how to manage it. That's not what I asked, she said. He looked at her. The streetlight above them was doing the city's usual work, orange, practical, unflattering. And in it his face was exactly what it was. No ambient assistance, just the actual face of the actual man who had driven across the city for a stranger 9 days ago on the basis of 60 seconds of instinct and 5 years of carried guilt. I don't know, he said. It was the most honest thing she'd heard him say, and he said it without any performance of honesty, which was the only way it could have landed the way it did. I'll be all right, she said. He looked at her. I know, he said. They reached her building. It was an ordinary building on an ordinary block, 6 stories, pre-war, the kind of building that had outlasted several of its tenants' ideas about where they'd be in 5 years. She stopped on the sidewalk in front of it and turned to face him, and they stood there in the orange light with the city behind both of them and 9 days of unusual history between them. I need a week, she said, to be in my apartment and not think about any of this. Take whatever you need, he said. After the week, she said, I want to have a conversation that isn't about Dante Moretti or federal investigations or what we both need from each other operationally. All right, he said. A dinner, she said, somewhere I choose. Something moved in his face. The potential of a smile again, the same thing she'd seen at the restaurant on the first night. Not performed, just present, brief and warm and slightly surprised, like something that had arrived without being planned. All right, he said again. Lucien. She said his name the way she'd been saying it for a week, with the weight of familiarity, and he received it the same way he always did, carefully, like something placed. Thank you for coming to the restaurant, for everything after. He looked at her for a moment. You did most of it, he said. We both know that's not entirely true, she said. It's true enough, he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she turned and went inside. She stood in her apartment for a long time without turning on the lights. The darkness was not uncomfortable. It was the ordinary darkness of a lived-in space, the shapes of furniture she knew, the ambient light from the street coming through windows she hadn't covered. She stood in it and breathed and let the week decompress through her body, like pressure releasing from a system that had been sealed too long. She went to bed. She slept in her bed, not the couch. She didn't dream about anything she remembered. The week passed. It passed in the specific way that weeks pass after large events. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the slightly unreal quality of time that has lost its usual orientation markers. She went to work. She sat at her desk. She reopened the brand guidelines for the Brooklyn sisters, who were named Ava and Claudette, and were both 29 years old and had started their company out of a shared apartment 3 years ago with a credit card and a very clear idea about what they wanted to make and who they wanted to make it for. She worked on their project with the full attention she'd been unable to give it for 2 weeks, and it turned out to be genuinely good work, the kind that arrived when you'd been through something that rearranged your sense of proportion, when small creative problems felt solvable because you'd recently solved larger ones. She sent Ava and Claudette the preliminary concepts on a Thursday afternoon. Ava replied within 20 minutes with a voice memo that was mostly excited noise followed by the word yes repeated 6 times. Alara sat at her desk and listened to it and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the night she'd stood in a restaurant bathroom and sent a text to the wrong number. Priya appeared at her desk at 4:15 with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who had been patient for a long time and had decided the patience had reached its term. "Sit down," Alara said. Priya sat. "I'm going to tell you something," Alara said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Priya wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Okay," Alara told her. "Not everything. Not the room in the West 30s or the federal investigation or Carver or the 22nd floor on a Wednesday night. But enough." She told her about Dante and the restaurant and the text and Lucienne, and she told her about the week afterward, the shape of it, if not every specific, and she told her about the hotel bar and what it had cost her to sit in it. When she finished, Priya was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I told you to date him." "I know," Alara said. "I said he texted back." "You did." "I'm so sorry," Priya said. And it wasn't about texting back. It was about the whole of what Alara had described, the shape of it, and Alara heard that and nodded. "You didn't know," she said. "I didn't know." "This man," Priya said carefully. "Devereaux. Are you?" "I don't know yet," Alara said. "I'm having dinner with him next week." Priya looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had approximately 47 questions and was choosing to ask none of them. "Is he?" she started. "Complicated," Alara said. "That's not reassuring." "No," Alara agreed. "It isn't." They sat with their coffees. Around them, the office made its late afternoon sounds, keyboards and low conversation, and the particular frequency of a shared space at end of day when people were beginning the mental transition toward other lives. "Are you okay?" Priya said. Not the casual version, the real version. Alara thought about it honestly. "I think I'm becoming okay," she said. "I think there's a difference." Priya nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said, "there is." The following week was when the first public reporting appeared. It was not front page. Financial crimes investigations, when they turned, rarely were, and the story that began to emerge in the business press was written in the measured, heavily sourced language of journalists who understood they were handling material with legal weight. Agent Cross was placed on administrative leave pending internal review. 3 of her cooperating witnesses were identified as subjects of the review's secondary inquiry. One of them was named. Dante Moretti's name appeared in the 4th paragraph of a story in a financial publication on a Tuesday morning, referenced as a person of interest in an investigation into the conduct of a federal agent. Alara read it at her desk with her coffee going cold beside her. She read it twice. She put her phone face down and went back to the Brooklyn Sisters project, and did not pick her phone up again for 2 hours, which was the longest she'd managed in 3 weeks, and which felt like the correct response to the information. Not celebration, not satisfaction, not grief, just the acknowledgement that it had happened, that the consequences had arrived for the person who had manufactured consequences for her, and that the machinery of the world had ground in a direction that was at least approximately just, which was more than you could usually count on. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Lucien Yen. She wrote, "I saw the news." He replied, "I know." She wrote, "How are you?" A pause longer than his usual ones. Then, "Managing." She wrote, "Dinner is still on." His reply came fast, faster than most of his replies. "Yes." She put her phone down and smiled at her desk, and did not perform the smile for anyone because there was no one watching, which was the only kind of smile she trusted anymore. She chose a restaurant in the West Village, a small Italian place she'd been going to for 3 years. The kind of place with 12 tables and a menu written on a chalkboard, and a proprietor named Gino who had been making the same 4 pastas since 1987 and had no interest in making anything else. It was not expensive or impressive or elevated in any way that would signal anything about power or performance. It was just good, and she knew it. And she wanted to be in a room where she knew what things were. She told Lucien the name and the address and the time. He said, "I'll be there." She wore the same black dress. She didn't make a decision about the black dress. She reached into her closet, and it was the first thing her hand found, and she put it on and was halfway to the door before she realized what she'd taken. She stood in the small hallway of her apartment and considered changing. She didn't change. She went to the restaurant and arrived 3 minutes early, which was intentional, and Gino seated her at the corner table she'd asked for, the one with the view of the room and the door, and she sat and ordered a glass of wine and watched the room and let herself just be there, in the ordinary warm noise of a neighborhood restaurant on a Friday night, which was something she hadn't allowed herself since before Velvet Meridian. Lucien came through the door at exactly 7 o'clock. He was not in the black tailored coat. He was in something less formal, dark jacket, no tie, the kind of dress down that still carried its own precision. He scanned the room the same way he always scanned rooms, fast and specific, and found her immediately, and came to the table and sat down across from her. He looked tired, more tired than the parking garage, more tired than the 22nd floor, the accumulated fatigue of weeks of consequence management visible in the particular quality around his eyes. He also looked, she searched for the word and arrived at it, present. More present than he'd been in the operational context of the previous weeks, when there had always been a layer of processing between him and the immediate moment. "You found it all right," she said. "Yes." He looked at the room. "It's small." "I know," she said. "I like it." He looked back at her. "So do I," he said, and she believed him. Gino appeared and described the specials in the way he always described them, with no particular salesmanship, just information, take it or leave it. And Lucien listened and asked one question about the preparation of the lamb, and Gino answered it with the approval of someone whose technical questions he considered worth his time. After Gino left, Lucien said, "How is the work?" "Good," she said. "The project I was working on when this started, it came back together. I think it's actually the best thing I've done in a year." "The Brooklyn sisters." She looked at him. "You remembered that." "You mentioned them. In the parking garage." He paused. "When you were telling me what you were losing by getting into the car." She absorbed that. The fact that he had filed that specific detail, kept it, pulled it from 3 weeks of accumulated detail to place here. "The Brooklyn sisters are named Ava and Claudette," she said, "and they make clothing from reclaimed fabric, and they sent me a voice memo that was mostly them yelling yes when I sent the first round of concepts, and it was the best professional moment I've had in about 18 months. He looked at her. Something had moved in his expression, the potential of a smile again, the same one she'd been cataloging since the restaurant, but fuller this time, less restrained by circumstance. "Good," he said. "Lucien." She set her wine glass down. "I want to ask you something that isn't about anything operational." "All right." "The network," she said. "Your world. What I've seen of it, Serafina, Carver, the building in the West 30s. Is that what your life looks like, day to day?" He was quiet for a moment. "Mostly," he said. "Does it have to?" He looked at her carefully. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking whether the version of your life that exists is the version you chose, or the version that accumulated while you were managing other things. He turned his wine glass on the table. Slowly, a quarter rotation. His hands were still, the way they usually were, but the motion of the glass was something, a tell, she realized, one she hadn't identified before. He turned things when he was thinking about something he hadn't thought about in a while. Both, he said finally. It's both. If it could be less, she said. If some of the infrastructure could change, the parts that need to, because of the investigation and the Harlow restructuring, would you change them? He looked at her directly. Are you asking whether I'm capable of existing outside the context you've known me in? I'm asking whether you want to. The pasta arrived. Gino set it down without ceremony and departed without asking if they needed anything, which was his usual approach, operating on the theory that if you needed something, you would say so. Lucian looked at the food and then at her. I've been doing this for a long time, he said. The structure of it, the network. It didn't begin as a choice. I came into it through my family, through circumstances, through a series of decisions that each individually made sense in their moment. He paused. Mara's death was the first time I looked at the full picture and saw clearly what it cost. Not just her, what it cost as a permanent operating condition. And after that I was too far in to see a different shape clearly, he said. The network was too established, the obligations too layered. He turned his wine glass again. But the investigation, this particular pressure, over the last 3 weeks, it's created a kind of forced restructuring. Several of the most significant obligations are going to have to dissolve. Some of the infrastructure will simplify by necessity. That sounds like you're framing it as an external process, she said. Something happening to you. He looked at her. I'm asking if you're making a choice, she said. Not managing a change. The table was small enough that there wasn't much space between them. The restaurant went about its ordinary business around them. Gino moved between tables. Someone at the bar laughed at something. Yes, he said. I'm making a choice. She picked up her fork. Good, she said. Now, eat your food. He ate. They talked for 2 hours. Not about investigations or operations or the machinery of consequence, about other things, smaller things, the texture of ordinary life that had been entirely absent from every conversation they'd had in the previous 3 weeks. She told him about her father's house, the managed silences of it, the choreography she'd learned and spent years unlearning. He told her about the city where he'd grown up. Not this one, a smaller one, a mid-sized place with industrial neighborhoods and a river that flooded every few years. And the way he'd left it at 17 with 2 bags and the specific certainty of someone who has decided that whatever they will become somewhere else. She told him about her first year in New York, the apartment she'd shared with 3 other people, the way the city had felt enormous and hostile, and then gradually, incrementally, like something she could navigate. He told her about Serafina, not operationally, but as a sister, the specific texture of having someone who had known him before all of this, who carried the prior version of him in her memory and refused to let it become mythologized. She likes you, he said. I like her, Alara said. She's direct. It's refreshing. She's been known to be overwhelming, he said. She's been known to be right, Alara said. Those aren't the same thing. The potential smile again, fully realized this time, and she found that she'd been right about the warmth in it. Not performed, not asymmetrical in the calculated way Dante's had been, just genuine and slightly unexpected. The smile of someone who had spent a long time not smiling about anything. Gino brought the check without being asked, because it was nearly 10 and he had opinions about lingering, and Lucy Yen took it before she could, and she didn't argue because she was choosing her battles, and this one wasn't worth it. On the street outside, the night was cold and clear, the city doing its Friday business, louder than the previous weeks had been, the ambient noise of a weekend beginning. Walk me to the corner, she said. He walked her to the corner. They stood under the light, and she turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with the same steadiness he'd had since the restaurant on the first night, the dark, unrushed quality of it, but without the controlled restraint that had lived alongside it. Something had changed in the last 3 hours. Some internal adjustment, the kind that happened slowly and then all at once. I need to tell you something, he said. Okay? In the parking garage, he said, when you asked whether there was any version of tonight where you weren't going to be in that bar, and I said no. He paused. That was true. The operation required it, and I knew when I was preparing you that the preparation was toward that end. I didn't tell you that directly, and I should have. She looked at him. I know, she said. I've thought about it. And you should have told me directly, she said. And you knew that, which is why you answered the question honestly when I asked it instead of trying to reframe it. She paused. You don't have to carry that as a separate debt. It's in the account. He looked at her. The account. We're going to accumulate things, she said. Both of us. I'm going to do things wrong, and so are you. And the question is whether the account is solvent overall, not whether any individual transaction is clean. She held his gaze. I think the account is solvent. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out, and his hand was at her jaw, careful. The same certainty she'd seen in how he moved through rooms applied here. Precise and unhurried, and she held still for it, looking up at him in the Friday night light of a West Village corner. He kissed her. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of kiss that announced itself. It was the kind that arrived because the distance between two people had simply become unsustainable, the kind that carried 3 weeks of accumulated weight and delivered it without theater. When he pulled back, she looked at him for a moment. The account is solvent, she said again, quiet. Yes, he said. She stepped back, not away, just to the appropriate distance for a street corner at 10 on a Friday night. Call me tomorrow, she said. Yes, he said. She walked toward her building and did not look back because looking back was a habit she was working on, and this was as good a place to practice it as any. 3 months passed. They passed in the ordinary way of time that contains difficult things alongside good ones. No clean separation. Everything concurrent. The investigation into Cross completed, and she was referred for prosecution on 2 counts. Dante Moretti retained counsel and issued a statement through that counsel that said very little in a great many words. 2 of the women who had withdrawn their reports filed new ones, this time with a different investigative context, and this time they were not withdrawn. Elara did not follow the reporting closely. She followed it enough to know what was happening and not enough to let it become the architecture of her days. She had the Brooklyn Sisters Project, which launched in February to the kind of response that made Ava send another voice memo. This one, 3 minutes long. She had the apartment she was sleeping in properly again. She had Priya, who had arrived at approximately 12 separate strong opinions about Lucien Devereaux without ever meeting him and expressed them all with complete confidence. She had Lucien, which was its own category. Not simple, not without the accumulated weight of what they'd both brought into it, but present and honest, and characterized by the specific qualities she'd identified on the first night and been unable to name at the time. What it was, she'd determined eventually, was consistency. He was the same person in every context she'd encountered him in, and that sameness, the willingness to be identical across circumstances, to not perform differently for different rooms, was the thing she'd been missing her entire adult life without having the vocabulary for it. They were not without friction. She told him when she was angry and he was not always graceful about receiving it, had the ingrained tendency of someone who had spent years being the authority in every room to initially respond to challenge as a logistical problem rather than an emotional one. She called him on it when it happened. He adjusted. Not immediately and not without the friction of it, but he adjusted, and the adjustment was genuine, which was the only kind worth anything. He was working on the restructuring. The Harlow project had been divested, cleanly and at cost, and the network had simplified in the ways it had been forced to simplify, and some of the obligations had dissolved the way he'd predicted they would. He was not the same person operationally that he'd been before October, and she did not pretend to know all the ways that was true, but she knew the version of him she was in contact with, and that version was present. More present than she suspected he'd been in a long time. Serafina took her for coffee in February and looked at her across a small table and said, without preamble, "He hasn't been like this since before Mara." Elara held her coffee cup. "What was he like before?" "Less armor," Serafina said simply. "He put most of it on afterward. Not all at once. Gradually. The way you do when you keep deciding to protect yourself, and eventually you can't remember not being protected." Elara thought about that for a long time afterward, about the specific mechanics of armor and how it was always constructed from something real, always built on an actual wound, and how the cruelty of it was that it worked. It did what it was built to do. but at the cost of every true thing that tried to get through. In March, Lucien came to her apartment for dinner. This was not the first time. He'd been there several times by then, and she'd been to the place of his she'd been given access to, a renovated apartment in a building she would never have found without being taken there. But this particular night she'd cooked, which was something she did well and had missed doing for company, and he arrived on time with wine he'd selected with attention and sat in her kitchen while she finished cooking, and they talked about nothing in particular. Her mother, who was visiting the following month from where she'd retired to a smaller city upstate. Serafina's recent and apparently spectacular failure at a dating app that had produced 3 weeks of material. He was at ease in her kitchen in a way he hadn't been in October, the armor genuinely thinner, not gone. She didn't think it would ever be entirely gone, and she didn't think she'd want it to be. It was part of who he was, part of what had been built from real material, but thinner, admitting more. After dinner, they sat on her couch with the remains of the wine and the city doing its night business outside the windows. And he had one arm along the back of the couch behind her, and she was turned toward him with her feet tucked up, and they were quiet in the comfortable way of people who no longer needed to fill silences. She thought about Velvet Meridian. She thought about the 41st floor and the rain and Dante's hand on her wrist and the bathroom mirror and the shaking hands that sent a text to the wrong number. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "October," she said. He was quiet. "Not badly," she said. "Just, it was the same city and it looks entirely different now." He turned his head and looked at her. The lamplight was doing better work than fluorescent or streetlight, and in it his face was... She stopped looking for the analytical description and let herself just look. Good. Just good, the way things are when they're where they're supposed to be. "You're different," he said. Not as an assessment, just an observation. "From October?" "From October." "I know," she said. "I'm louder." Something moved in his face. "Yes." "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, and meant it completely. She leaned in and kissed him, and he received it with both hands, careful and certain in equal measure. And outside the city kept its lights on and went about its business. Indifferent and relentless and full of the ordinary, extraordinary possibility of 10 million lives proceeding in parallel, none of them knowing about the wrong number, none of them knowing about the 60 seconds before Rational arrived, none of them needing to. Some things happened without witnesses. Some things were better that way. 6 months after October, on an evening in early spring when the light in the city was doing the particular thing it only did for 2 or 3 weeks a year, low and gold and entirely unlike itself, the light of somewhere warmer arriving temporarily, Lucien said he wanted to show her something. He drove. She didn't ask where they were going, which would have seemed strange to the version of her that existed before October, and seemed completely natural now. The trust built not from a single decision, but from the accumulated texture of 6 months of consistent small acts, the kind of trust that couldn't be announced or demanded, but only arrived, quietly, after enough time. He parked on a street she didn't know, a block from the water, and they walked to a small restaurant she'd never been to. Nothing impressive, 8 tables, a sign that needed repainting, the kind of place that had been in the same spot for 20 years on the basis of pure quality. She stopped on the sidewalk and looked at it. "Why here?" she said. "Mara liked this place," he said. "I haven't been back since she died. I wanted to come back with you." She stood on the sidewalk in the gold spring light and looked at the restaurant, and then at him, and felt the weight of what he was offering. Not a grand gesture, not a ceremony, just an honest act, the placing of something he'd carried alone for 5 years into the shared space between them. "Okay," she said. "Let's go in." They went in. They sat at a table near the window and ordered from a menu that hadn't changed much in 5 years, and the food was exactly as good as the place's unprepossessing exterior deserved. And they talked about small things, comfortable things. And outside the window, the spring light did its brief annual work on the city. Once in the middle of dinner, Lucien set his fork down and looked out the window at the street, and his face had a quality she'd learned to recognize. The specific stillness of someone present in the moment and also in a memory simultaneously. And she didn't say anything, just let it be what it was, let the space hold both things. He looked back at her. "She would have liked you," he said. "I think I would have liked her," Ilara said. He picked up his fork. They finished dinner, On the street outside, the gold light was fading toward the ordinary blue of evening, the city resuming its usual spectrum, and they stood for a moment at the edge of the sidewalk before walking back to the car. She took his hand, not dramatically, not with any statement attached to it, just she put her hand in his because the distance between them was the wrong distance, and her hand knew where it belonged, and he held it with the particular combination of certainty and care that characterized everything he did. And they walked back to the car in the quiet of early spring evening, the city loud around them and entirely separate, doing its own thing, not touching this. This was theirs. This had been theirs since a bathroom in a restaurant on the 41st floor of a glass tower, since a text sent to the wrong number, since 60 seconds of pure instinct in a man who had learned to operate only on calculation, since a woman who had learned to be agreeable found out she had been disagreeable inside all along and was only just starting to let it show. The wrong number. The right person. And the city keeping its lights on regardless, the way it always did, the way it always would, indifferent and relentless, and completely unchanged by the fact that somewhere in its enormous ongoing noise, two people had found each other through an accident and made something real. Which was, of course, how most real things were found. By accident. By instinct. By the 60 seconds before rational arrived. Pa,